Welcome everyone to the Student Café organized by the Society for Ethnobotany, also known as SEB. I'm Nishant Gurav and I'm a member of the SEB Student Committee, and I'm so happy and so thankful that you all have taken time to join us today. The Student Cafe is an interaction, a virtual interaction that's organized by the Student Committee, mainly for young researchers, any plant enthusiasts across the world to connect with people who have worked in this field and interact with them, and most importantly, come together and discuss about the love we have and appreciation we have for indigenous knowledge and indigenous communities across the world. The Society for Ethnobotany is an organization whose mission is to foster and encourage scientific research, education, related activities on the past, present, and future uses of plants and the relationship between plants and people, and to make the results of such research available to the scientific community and the general public through meetings and publications. And we are in the middle of one of those activities right now. The Society for Ethnobotany is a wonderful place for people who are really enthusiastic and curious about plant-related knowledge. So therefore, it provides a membership opportunity for people from all walks of life, and especially for students. And the membership for students is about $35 a year. And I was informed just recently that there are a few gift memberships that are available for students from developing countries. So if you would like to apply for these gift memberships, kindly look at the chat box in a few minutes. I will put the email address of Amelia, who's in charge of that. For others who'd still like to get the full membership without the gift membership, there are a lot of benefits of the membership. For example, you would be eligible to submit manuscripts to the society's journal, Economic Botany. Now it's Ethnobotany and Economic Botany. You also will have opportunity to attend the annual meeting. Speaking of which, this year the annual meeting will be happening in Montpellier about from May 31st to June 3rd or 4th, around that time. So do check out our page for that. And you will also have access to a lot of recordings and member-only events. You'll have access to the biannual newsletter. You will also be in the network of a lot of ethnobotanists so that you can cooperate with them and discuss about the work you do with like-minded people. So do go ahead and subscribe to the society, and I'm sure that many students and researchers would really be benefited from that. Now, coming to today's Student Cafe, I'm so thankful to Professor Morgan Ruelle for accepting our invitation. He is an assistant professor at the Environmental Science and Policy program in the Department of International Development, Community and Environment from Clark University. He has a PhD in natural resources from Cornell University, and he's interested in how biological and cultural diversity enable communities to anticipate and adapt to change. His work also focuses on how the diversity within food systems provide options to communities so that they can respond to climate change. He integrates indigenous and other place-based ecological knowledge with a broad array of scientific tools. He also strives to include communities in every stage of the research cycle to co-generate knowledge that is locally relevant and broadly meaningful. which is very close to what today's topic is going to be about, discussing the varieties with the farmers. So I'm sure that you will see that part of his research. I would also like to announce that this meeting is being recorded, so I kindly ask you to keep yourself on mute. If you have a question, kindly use the chat box. And if you would like to wait with your question until the end, we will have about 15 to about 20 minutes for discussion. So you can, after the talk is over, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. So without further ado, let me again thank Professor Morgan for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us today. And I hope that we have a wonderful discussion. So over to you, Professor Morgan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nishant, for the warm introduction and welcome. And it was really an honor to receive the invitation. I'm very pleased to join all of you. I see some familiar faces and lots of new friends. So I'm excited to engage in discussion here. And I'll also be in Montpellier. So hopefully we'll have a chance to be together then as well. As Nishant mentioned today, I'd like to really talk about my experiences working with farmers to understand the plant diversity in their landscapes and its significance, meaning for them. Let me make sure I can advance my slides. I'm going to start with some conceptual underpinnings of the way I think about diversity and the way we all see it, whether we're a farmer or a researcher. And those are some ideas that I'm building on others and maybe grounds for some discussion. And then I'm going to talk about some experiences that I've had in Ethiopia looking at different aspects of plant diversity in different places, in different ways, different scales, and just share some little tidbits from different research projects that I think give us some places to land in terms of our understanding of what farmers see in diversity. And then I wanted to spend a bit of time at the end talking about the practice of speaking with farmers, particularly the importance of working with mentors, honoring farmers' time, and also of going back to the same people at least once. That will be one of my calls for all of you to make sure that we're honoring those relationships. So I often begin classes where I'm talking about diversity with a kind of thought experiment where I show students an image like this and I say, where do you see more diversity? And sometimes it's these kinds of colors, or sometimes it's pictures of plants or trees. But I think the purpose of doing that, and I think you can take a moment to do this yourself, is to realize that there are many different things we're processing when we look at the universe and decide that it's diverse or not. You know, we're dealing with the degrees of difference between things. We're dealing with the significance of those differences, the numbers of differences. And if you come from ecology, we think of richness and evenness and those kinds of factors. So I really think diversity is in the eye of the beholder in a lot of ways. And from a cognitive science perspective, difference really enables us to see the world, right? We wouldn't be able to sense if we couldn't tell the difference between, say, hot and cold or light and dark. It's those differences that activate our senses and enable us to navigate. And difference is therefore fundamental to the knowledge that we all are so interested in. Without the diversity around us in our environment and in every aspect of our lives, we wouldn't know anything. However, the differences that we could be processing are effectively infinite. And so what's so interesting, I think, in ethnobotany is how different people decide which differences matter. And I think that's a core interest of many ethnobotanists, whether we frame it that way or not. But that's a core interest for me, for sure. So I know there have been many times that people have called for hypotheses, grand theories in ethnobotany, and I've been thinking about what those are for me. And today I'm going to address these in some ways, but I certainly don't have. I'm certainly not testing them completely. The first one is that people recognize greater diversity among the plants that they use or otherwise value. And I'm going to show you some evidence of that in the way that I approach that. The second, and this is probably the thesis of my whole career, at least so far, is that communities that maintain knowledge of a greater diversity of plants exhibit a higher adaptive capacity, meaning that they can anticipate and respond to change more effectively than those communities that know less about the diversity around them and therefore have fewer possibilities to use plants in their food and health systems. And the third one is kind of a corollary, maybe a mechanistic explanation of the second, that plant diversity and our knowledge of it provides us with complementarity and functional redundancy that we need to maintain our food and health systems according to our cultural values. So I'm going to share with you pieces of my experiences in Ethiopia, which is the place I've worked the most. I've also done a fair amount of work in the Standing Rock Nation in North and South Dakota. I don't have any active projects there, but would love to again someday soon. I did my dissertation research on plant diversity within food systems and its contributions to food sovereignty and climate adaptation in Dabark, Ethiopia, which I'll show you a map in a moment. And then I did a postdoc that focused on legume diversity across the country, working with various academic institutions and lots of different students for several years following my dissertation. And then more recently, I've been collaborating closely with the New York Botanical Garden. Dr. Alex McAlvey is the principal investigator for a lot of this work on traditional grain mixtures. So I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. And across all of these projects, I use a wide range of research methods, and I'm sure many, if not most of you, are familiar with these. Ideally, I really like to engage the same farming families multiple times, conducting free listing and ranking, various kinds of ranking activities, and participatory mapping. Those are three areas that I really focus on. I always collect voucher specimens and would encourage you all to do that. I do vegetation surveys. I do a lot of GIS and analysis of satellite imagery, so remote sensing. And then I also believe pretty strongly in meeting with farmers, convening groups of farmers to review and validate both individual and collective findings from research and sharing outputs from our research that is meaningful for them, both orally and in written formats. So my dissertation focused in the Dabark district of the Amhara region. It's in the far north, kind of at the border of the Tigray region. It's a really mountainous place. Ethiopia is very mountainous, I think most of you know. This is one of the highest areas in Dabark. Most of the landscape is above 2,800 meters above sea level. It's close to the highest peak, Rastajan, in the Simien Mountains of northern Amhara. And I was investigating all kinds of plant diversity and its role in the food system. Free listing with farmers, where I simply ask farmers to name all of the plants that matter to them in their community and in surrounding landscape. We generated something like 217 names of different plants across various life forms. And of course, these are roughly equivalent to these terms in English, but lots of trees, lots of vegetables, many, many crops. And one thing that I did to understand the significance of this diversity and to kind of test that first hypothesis that I was sharing with you was I applied Brent Berlin's folk taxonomic, whoops, I'm out of order, applied folk taxonomic classification to kind of assign the names of plants to various levels of categorization by local people. And so this is a flow chart that I made, but very much based on Dr. Berlin's work, taking a name and deciding, does it belong to a folk generic level? Is it a life form? Is it a folk specific or a folk varietal? And I know that this isn't a perfect system, but I found it very useful to think about the relationship between what a Linnaean trained taxonomist would see and what a farmer sees in terms of diversity. And when we do that, and we look at the number of names of plants within the different categories of life forms that are locally, culturally meaningful, we see that there are big differences in the distribution of the types of names. For example, with trees, you can see you have a lot of folk generics, and very few folk specifics. So lots of knowledge about trees, but not as much differentiation among what are recognized as generics. And then lots of folk specifics and especially folk varietals when it comes to crops. So that to me is tentatively supporting this idea that because these farmers are so focused on field crops, they're dividing, they're categorizing and naming even more and more specific and eventually very distinct varieties of the crops that they grow. And so they're seeing more intricate relationships within that set of life forms than they are among trees, for example, which are pretty rare at this point in the landscape. And so there's a lot of diversity, but they don't encounter most of them very often. Dr. Berlin and others have looked at ways in which you can compare folk taxonomies to Linnaean taxonomy and make conclusions about what people care about. So one example of this is a case of under-differentiation of these are all plants that belong to different genera, and one of them belongs to a completely different family. So we have three species here, three genera here within Asteraceae, and one within Papaveraceae, the Mexican poppy, down in the bottom right corner. All of these are actually given the same name within the vernacular Amharic of the bark. And even when I've gone back with this picture to farmers and said, how can these all be the same thing? People know that they're different, but they say we don't bother with names for those to distinguish them. And part of it is that they're all spiny, noxious weeds from the perspective of farmers. And so there isn't an interest in naming them. They can describe them and they can say, oh, the word for them is koshisheli. They can say, oh, there's one koshisheli that, the echinops in the corner has these white flowers and so on, but they haven't assigned distinct names. So that's a case of under differentiation that I think is, it tells us something about the appreciation of this particular set of diverse organisms. By comparison, if we look at barley, for one example, there are a lot of barley farmers or a lot of farmers that grow barley into bark. Each of these seed heads here has a distinct name. And in fact, some of them even have their own folk generic. There are folk generics that are different depending on the length of time it takes for the barley to come to maturity. So these are over differentiated because there are multiple folk genera referring to what in a Linnaean taxonomy would be a single species. So here farmers are seeing all kinds of diversity, not only the apparent diversity of the seed heads, but also they have experience growing these, they know how long they take to mature, how they respond to different weather conditions, their nutritional value for various reasons, their use in culinary traditions. So all of those things add up to people paying very, very close attention to these species and naming very different things. By contrast, in Linnaean taxonomy, we haven't even agreed on any kind of subspecific categories within barley, to my knowledge. So lots of attention to diversity there. So shifting to the legume diversity project, this again was a collaboration between 6 universities, Cornell, and 5 Ethiopian universities. And over the course of 4 years, we had 2 cohorts of altogether 20 Masters of Science students in different programs at the different universities. But each student was assigned to investigate the varietal diversity of a particular legume in 2 zones, which are an administrative unit in Ethiopia. And so they were comparing the varietal diversity across different agroecological zones as well as different cultural contexts. And we were really focused on farmers' traditional varieties. This was all supported by the McKnight Foundation's Collaborative Crop Research Program, which was a really great organization to work with in terms of improving the experience of the students and the researchers and the impacts on policy as well. So just as one small example of the kinds of things that we were finding with these students, this is Bethlehem Abara was doing research on common bean varieties in far southwestern Ethiopia, in Shukka and Benchmaji. And these are photos that she took of many of the bean varieties. And common bean, I'm talking about Phaseolus vulgaris, was introduced to Ethiopia at least once in the 1600s, probably a few more times, but originally arrived with the Portuguese in the 1600s. And others have probably brought additional common bean varieties since then. But they maintain lots and lots of different varieties, most of which are recognized and named by farmers as distinct. They're really beautiful. And one of the things we did was we really tried to understand if there were patterns in the knowledge that farmers had about the advantages of different varieties under different climate conditions. So we asked farmers to independently assess, if we did some kind of scenarios where we said under optimal conditions, which of your varieties would have the highest yield, under if there were a drought, which one would be the most productive, and so on. And we looked for consistency across farmers within the same communities. And not too surprisingly, it's pretty hard to find consistent responses because there are so many other things that are affecting whether a particular variety will perform better under the optimal conditions even in every single location, right? Farmers are not just thinking about climate, they're also dealing with soils and their agronomic practice and so on. However, for some of these species, and we have a lot more, we found significant patterns where modeling could identify, okay, specific varieties are clearly seen as more productive under specific climate conditions, and that diversity contributes to climate adaptation because it provides the kinds of differences that farmers need, not only as climate conditions shift, but also when there's really high interannual variability in rainfall and temperature and so on. Another piece of what we found is that despite the availability of many varieties within the same zone, most of the time farmers don't grow more than one or two varieties within their household. And that was really surprising to us. So even in the case of benchmalchi and shuka that I showed you before, that Bethlehem documented, there are 19 bean varieties across the communities, but on average, a family only grows one or two, 1.5 was the average. And that was surprising to us because we anticipated that some people at least would be growing many, many varieties in order to take advantage of that diversity. But we have to remember that most of these farmers have very small land holdings, and often when asked, like, why don't you grow 3 varieties? They say they just don't have the space to do so. And so that seems to be the main limiting factor. We need more research on that probably. The other thing is that traditional varieties, as identified by the farmers, tend to be the ones that farmers focus on in almost all cases. But there are some new varieties, and those can either be varieties that were introduced by formal breeding services through extension, or they can be varieties that they've obtained through trade with neighboring communities. Those are also considered new. So it just depends on the context. But in general, there's either a balance of traditional and new varieties, but we found very few situations where most people were planting only introduced varieties. When we look at, from the variety perspective, the percentage of farmers who are using any particular variety of legume, we find that very few are used by more than 2/3 of interviewees. So in other words, if we combine this graph with the previous one, every farmer is growing only one or two, but they tend to be growing very different varieties within the same community. So the diversity is higher at the community level than it is at the household level by far. Many of the varieties have really low use. So less than 1/3 of all the people we interviewed said that they had grown them at any time. And some have already said they're already disappeared. They don't know if they're used currently at all. So past use only. And at first this gave me, this was alarming because I was concerned that with so many varieties with low use, that could imply that that varietal diversity is being lost. We'd have to look at that over time, of course, but the fact that there are quite a few that have only been used in the past makes us worry that they're not there. So we asked farmers if they know people within their community who are growing the varieties that they don't plant, which is a little bit confusing, but we wanted to find out if there was a situation where people thought their neighbors were growing a variety, but in fact they were not, and that would contribute to loss because people don't know who in their community is maintaining a population of seeds of the different varieties. And we found out, at least this indicates that most of the time farmers are pretty knowledgeable about the other varieties that are being planted. Um, at least, for example, in the case of fava bean, the varieties that they don't plant, they accurately named varieties that other people are planting. And we found those varieties planted by other people in the same community during interviews 94% of the time, which is reassuring from the perspective of varietal conservation. For common bean, a little bit less, but that could also be an artifact of the fact that there's much higher numbers of varieties. Okay, next little snippet is about the traditional grain mixtures project, which is ongoing. And this is exciting because we're bringing together ethnobotanists, agronomists. I have a student who's an ethnopodologist or a budding one, and also folks who are doing nutritional analysis of traditional grain mixtures. And I'll tell you what those look like in a moment, but basically we're doing surveys and interviews, we're doing mother and baby trials with the agronomists. We have interviews for the ethnopodology, soil testing, and then also really cutting edge lab work that's supported by the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. That is a project of the Rockefeller Foundation and the alliance between SEAT and Bioversity. So farmers in Ethiopia, but we've found in many parts of the world, and maybe some of you have encountered this, plant multiple species of varieties of a plant on the same field, including sometimes multiple species from the same plant family. So for example, the first varietal mixture that I encountered, or sorry, the first traditional grain mixture that I encountered was wheat and barley. And when I was in Debark, this was actually treated as a distinct plant. So I was doing free listing and asking about field crops, and this name kept coming up, Durania. And I kept asking, what is Durania? And they would tell me, well, it's a little bit like wheat and it's a little bit like barley. At least that's how it was getting translated at the time. And then finally, when it came to maturity, I was able to visit the field and find out that it was both wheat and barley mixed together, and in fact, multiple varieties of each of those two species being sown as a single crop, being harvested together, being processed and prepared as a food together. And there's definitely a recognition that it's a composite of many different things, but it was managed as a single crop, which I found really fascinating. But similarly, but also a little bit different, and I'll talk about this one more, many farmers mix fava bean and field pea in the same field, and these are broadcast at the same time. They may be harvested together or they may be harvested separately depending on their maturity times. And then we also are very interested in varietal mixtures of the same species, and there are many examples of these in Ethiopia, but one that's common is teff. There are practices of planting multiple varieties of teff together and harvesting those and processing them together, and also sorghum. So again, Dr. McKelvey is a lead on this project, and we have a lot of different partners at Ethiopian universities. And one of our ideas is that there are various levels of diversity at the field scale to consider as polycultures, right? So if we think of polycultures as anytime we're planting multiple plants in the same place, on the one hand, we're all pretty familiar with intrafamilial intercropping, right? So, you know, maize and beans, or maize and beans and squash on the same field. 3 different species or 2 different species from different families that are very, very different from each other and complement each other's growth in different ways and so on. And there's more literature on varietal mixtures, it turns out, where people mix varieties of the same species on the same field as an adaptation strategy as well. But what has received much less attention are these confamilial mixtures or intrafamilial mixtures, where multiple species from the same plant family are together. And so if you think about these as kind of a spectrum of genetic diversity on the one hand being much higher to the left, the functionality being more consistent as you move to the right, the nutritional complementarity being higher as you move back to the left, and then kind of the ease of management, especially synchronous maturity, being higher as you move to the right. Perhaps our theory is that, you know, this is kind of the sweet spot, that a lot of farmers want to have a crop that's reliable. They definitely want to make bread, for example, from their wheat, barley field. Some years, because of the climate conditions, you might have more barley. Other years, you might have more wheat. And particular varieties might become more abundant within your mixture. But you're going to be able to make bread is the idea there. You still have some nutritional complementarity because it turns out varieties of wheat and barley can have really different micronutrients. You can, in the case of wheat and barley, can manage them together. They can be selected for synchronous maturity, but they also may respond to different climate conditions differently. That's key. So this past summer, I've been doing research with my student in South Wollo, Ethiopia, which is also in the Amhara region, far to the east. And one of the mixtures that we're studying again are these faba bean field pea mixtures. They are broadcast together, but in the communities we've visited, they're most often harvested separately. And it was really interesting to hear from farmers and try to understand what is their rationale for creating higher diversity on their fields. One of them is a very different reason, which is that the faba bean, which is is very erect, grows straight up, and it provides a kind of trellis for the field pea, if you think of it that way. So it's got a pretty stiff stem that can hold up field pea as long as the field pea isn't too heavy and overgrowing it too much. And they actually really, they say that they get higher yields of field pea and that the quality of the field pea is much higher if it's lifted up off the ground by the faba bean. And so they typically plant it in a ratio, I would even say more often 4-to-1. And oftentimes we were being told pretty specifically 15% field pea and 85% faba bean. The other interesting piece is that they're planting this mixture not on highly fertile soils and also not on degraded soils, but kind of on the medium fertility soils where both species can be super productive, but the faba bean won't grow so tall that it becomes leggy and falls over as a result of the field pea growing on it. And they actually prefer sloped sandy soils. So those are typically a little bit marginal for most cereal production, but they find that that's also good to avoid kind of waterlogging and also, again, overgrowing and lodging on that kind of land. There's a huge challenge for all legume production, but particularly for faba bean in eastern Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia, which is orobenki. It's a hemiparasitic weed similar to striga, if you know that. And it is spreading really quickly. The seeds stay in the seed bank for a really long time. It taps into the roots of legumes and uses up their nutrients. It's primarily parasitic, but it's also a little bit photosynthetic. So that's a huge issue. And there is a variety that's been introduced that is a little bit more tolerant of orobenki infestation than others. And so it's interesting to be seeing how that new variety is being incorporated into the mixture in some communities, and that seems promising. And the other thing that's important is that these mixtures aren't planted every year. So one of our PhD students at Addis Ababa University had a hard time finding farmers who grew the mixtures in particular years just because they're in a long rotation, often with cereals. And so at any one time, it can be hard to observe them. But this is actually a picture that she took. Her name is Sige Georgis. And hopefully her work it's under review for the second round in ethnobotany and economic botany. So hopefully we'll be able to share it with you all soon. Okay, so I'm going to stop there talking about kind of findings, and I'm doing this talk really out of order, but I wanted to end on some thoughts about practice, given that this is the student cafe. So this is my mentor, Professor Zemede Asfaw at Addis Ababa University. And the story I want to tell is that I think, like a lot of students, I went out and did interviews on my own for years. I never actually went with an ethnobotanist or with any other mentor to do interviews for several years. And part of that was I'd done some interviews as part of a job, working for a tribal government for a while. And then nobody really said, like, oh, you kind of figured it out, you can just go do it. And so I'd probably done, 200 or 300 interviews by the time I finally got to go out with a real master of interviewing. And watching this professor interview farmers, and in fact, farmers that I had already interviewed, and learn so much more during that one interview than I had with several iterations of interviewing the exact same people, was really, really important. And so I think I didn't appreciate for so long in my career that learning to conduct an interview well is really a lifelong pursuit. It's such a delicate craft. And so I think it's really important that we do that both as students, make sure that you get your mentors out of the office and hopefully they're a really good interviewer and you can see how they do it, invite them to lead so that you can observe. And then also, I know it sometimes takes some bravery, but ask them to observe you and reflect together on what's going well and what isn't. And most likely you have different styles, but you can share, different approaches to learning from farmers or whoever else you're interviewing um, in really effective ways and making those interviews meaningful on both sides. So that's my first kind of pitch is please do interviews with your mentors. Keeps them active too. The second thing I see a lot of us doing, and these are all things I've learned the hard way making these mistakes, is that whenever we're interviewing people about diversity, we often take this approach of asking them to name everything first, and then we go back and we ask them for details about everything they named. And I think there are a lot of problems with that approach because on the one hand, it's going to take so long if they name, sometimes a farmer will only name 5 things. And then you can ask a lot of detail about those 5 things, but sometimes they'll name, 50 things. And so for you to sit there and really collect detailed information about 30 or 40 or 50 different plants it's just not reasonable within the span of an interview. And yet I see people try to do that all the time. It also disincentivizes the farmer from naming all the plants that they know because they know this is going to happen. The more I name, the more I'm going to have to talk about everything I've named. And so they tend to hold things back. And I would do the same if I were in their position. And ultimately, I think we sacrifice the quality and integrity of our data if we're rushing through these questions about all the different plants that have already been named. So one thing that I've been trying myself and also encouraging students to do is to not always follow up with questions about every plant the farmer named. As you're listing them, if that's your protocol, figure out which are the ones that you've never heard of before and invest time in those because maybe you won't find anybody else who wants to talk to you about that. And then another option is to follow that knowledge holder's lead. So if they're really excited about a particular plant and you sense that when they're listing, talk about that one because they're probably going to enjoy the interview more if they're talking about the plants they really value and love. Um, so those are 2 ideas, and if you have others, I'd love to hear them, but I definitely find ways to construct your interview differently than list them all, tell me about all of them, because I think that we fall on our faces a little bit. The last thing, and this is related to the idea of just honoring farmers' time, is paying attention to subtle, often very polite signals that they're done. And again, this gets back to the idea of loss of data quality and integrity. Oftentimes what I experience, I don't know if others share this, is that at the beginning of an interview, I have full attention, we're really enjoying the conversation, and then things start to come into the room or come into the space, and the farmer gets distracted by many other things happening in their life, and they need to get back to those taking care of children or doing something on their farm. And people will feel bad telling you, oh, I need to go. And so it's really important to recognize that and be thinking about it, even though you're busy taking notes. Maybe it's time to stop. It's hard to stop because I know you're worried that you're not going to have another chance to talk to this individual. But I think if we get into the habit of going back, and I'll get to that next, it really changes the dynamic and kind of the way you're feeling about your interviews and the richness of information that we can gather if we're willing to go back. So this pushes us away from these kind of rapid survey techniques that I think a lot of us use where we're really focused on getting high numbers of participants. We're already dreaming of really powerful statistical analyses, but I would advocate for quality over quantity in so many of our research projects. Arrange to meet again, ideally, and I've done this a lot and it's been so fulfilling, bring the notes from the last time you met with somebody back and share them with the person that you interviewed. And that will show that you really listened and you really care and you heard what that person shared. And they will add all kinds of rich new information because they see that this is leading to something. It opens up the door to ask additional questions that, we always talk about semi-structured interviews and how during a semi-structured interview, you're supposed to ask these additional probing questions. But when you're in the midst of an interview, that is very, very hard to do. And I'm sure many of you have had the experience of you're looking at your data later and you're going, I wish I had asked this question. Going back gives you that chance, right, to ask again. Um, I've also had a lot of success, particularly when I'm working in English, so with Indigenous folks in the United States, sharing the way I'm interpreting not only their interview, but also trends I'm seeing across interviews. So saying like, oh, I've noticed that, whenever I talk about choke cherries, there are all these different um, foodway pathways or something like that. So it's a kind of a higher level interpretation than just the interview data itself is my point. And that can also, it can provide a chance for someone to comment on exactly how you're interpreting them. And then it's also okay, without naming names, because I know sometimes that can be tricky, to say, hey, another person I interviewed said something a little different, and I'd love to bounce this idea off of you. They said that this variety actually takes a really long time to mature, and you shared that it was really fast growing. So why is there a difference between the folks that I'm talking to? And that's also, I think, really important to interrogate. Um, the next thing about, sometimes we are often required, at least in the US context, to get consent for an interview before the interview actually begins, right? And so the person doesn't understand what they're going to be talking about in a lot of detail. You're required to inform them about the general topic, but they aren't really sure what will come up. And so it can be unfair sometimes to walk away and go, oh, they ended up talking about this sensitive topic. Did I really ask them for consent about that? And so going back, you can revisit those issues too. And I think that that's enhances our ethical practice to give people a second chance to say, hey, I don't really want to share that piece of what we talked about with the global public or even within their community. They've given it some thought and they wish they hadn't included it in the record. And consent should be ongoing. I think that's a principle of the International Society for Ethnobiology Ethics Code. But often our IRBs in the US don't really give us a mechanism to make sure that consent is persistent. And finally, I kind of alluded to this before, but going back, showing up again in the same community and especially in the same household really transforms your relationship with farmers from being one that feels, extractive probably to you, but also one that feels, like a one-off thing for the farmer and it's not really clear that you care about them as people or about their lives more broadly. And it really gives you grounds for doing more with the data that you have and the insights that you're generating with your research. So that's my final message. I'm really appreciative of all of you for being here, and Nishant again for the invitation and the student committee for supporting these activities. It's been really nice to see this space be held consistently across the year, and you're getting lots of exciting talks. Keep it up. Amelia and Heather at Society for Ethnobotany and the BSA are just amazing. And people like Trish, who I see here, and other friends in Society for Ethnobotany have been amazing. And I really encourage you to join our community because it's such a supportive place where we get to talk to each other about fun ideas. And yeah, come to the conference if you can, but also keep coming to these kinds of events to engage each other. And of course, I'm in deep gratitude to the thousands of farmers at this point that I've gotten to talk to in some way. So I'll stop there. I'll keep my screen up maybe in case there are folks who want to ask about particular slides, but I can also close it. Nishant, maybe you can decide if we want to see each other a little more easily.
Well, it's up to you. I guess, if someone asks a question, you can go back to the slide share
Sure.
it again. For
That,
now,
yeah, let me stop sharing
yeah.
so we can see each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Morgan. Um, Thank you for introducing us to this world from Debark in Ethiopia to a household garden of a farmer so far away. And it was really interesting to see everything that you presented. But I was really excited to see the folk taxonomy aspect finally coming up because we've never had that discussion in all the student cafes we've hosted. So you've definitely introduced something new as part of this series. I'm sure that people here, it grows their excitement towards this subject. I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna give the opportunity to the participants here. And again, thanks for presenting that. People who have joined, we have about 15 minutes left. So if you have any questions, kindly unmute and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I see Angela has a hand raised.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Angela. Yeah.
Hi, thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Morgan, for your presentation. Very insightful. And I was wondering about something. Have you ever encountered cases in which you need a translator to conduct your interviews, and how do you juggle in those times to try to be like try to understand what the other one is saying, but you have a translator next to you? How
Yeah,
does that work?
that's a great question. And yes, in Ethiopia, even though I can understand 80% of what is being said in Amharic, I still have somebody with me to translate complicated ideas because there are still things that I would miss. And when I was first starting my dissertation research, I wasn't able to study Amharic in the United States very much. So it was really basic at that point. So I actually enjoy working with a translator in many ways because it gives me an opportunity. There's a gap, there's a time gap. You get into this rhythm of hearing the farmer and paying attention to them, listening closely to the translator, but then the translator can go with your next question as you record notes and the next question is being answered. So oftentimes we kind of slow it down too much. We wait for the answer to write and then we finish writing before we ask. The trick that I've learned is ask your next question before you write your notes to the last question, because you can do those at the same time, especially if you're completely unaware of what the person is saying. They won't be distracting you. Um, the other thing I would call out is really working closely with your translator. Ideally, there's someone who really knows a lot about your subject, but on the other hand, doesn't have their own agenda that they want to come through from your interviews, because I've struggled with that in many cases. I often have worked with development agents or extension agents who have certain interests in the project. And so they tend to explain what the farmer is saying in certain ways, and that can be misleading, right? And so you have to ideally, you keep asking them, did you say that? Or did the farmer say that? What's going on here? But taking the time before you start any project to make sure that it's as close to word for word as possible. Great question.
Thank you.
Other questions? And if you're not comfortable unmuting, I'm happy to answer things in the chat as well.
Yes, if
Yes, it's
someone would like to ask a question through the chat box, I can read out your questions.
Sorry, in that case, I have another one. Um,
mm,
Dr. Morgan, I wanted to know about if you, because I'm hearing that you mentioned notes and notes. Do you ever use like recording? Do you ever record your interviews? If you also have the fact that there is a translator and you also want to double check things, or yeah.
Yep, I do both. It depends on the situation. Lately, I've been recording and taking notes because I think I definitely trust the accuracy of, if I'm going to use quotes in a qualitative research piece, I really want to have the recording to make sure that I'm capturing the wording correctly. So yeah, that is another backup, and it does help to bypass the issue I raised earlier with kind of the bias of a translator. Um, On the other hand, in the past, the reason that I didn't always record was because I was working in communities where that was pretty sensitive, and folks tended to decline interviews even sometimes if they knew they were being recorded. You just felt self-conscious, or so it just depends on the context whether that will make your relationship better, and or um, if people will be more tentative. A lot to think about, I think, about whether to record or not to record.
Yeah, I think Daphne, you can go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Sure, thank you.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. First of all, I found this really fascinating. I'm working on a methodology for my master's research right now, so I found it really relevant and especially appreciate that your learnings aren't just focused on the quality of your data, but also on your relationship with the farmers who you're interacting with. So my question was, I'm really curious about your suggestion of focusing on plants not mentioned by other participants as you're going through a field and like naming and discussing the different plants that are growing. And I'm curious how, if you're not going into detail or not asking kind of those follow up probes on every plant, how you ensure that you're not making assumptions about those plants or their use of those plants, or do you find that there's enough consistency from one farmer to the next that you can bypass some of those without making assumptions?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
that's a
great
great
question.
question.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question, and yeah, there are a lot of issues to navigate here. I definitely tried to, so I kind of kept a spreadsheet of which plants I had asked about, but from which farmers, and made sure in order to address that issue of like, I don't want there to be one plant that I only talk to one person about, especially if many farmers had mentioned it, but I hadn't followed up about it. And so it's, if it is just one farmer that knows about one plant, I think that's where you're at. You have to ask about that from that person. But if you have the opportunity to ask, I think keeping track as you're going through your interviews and going, okay, it's time to ask another person about that plant, that could be a strategy to avoid like too much focused information from a small number of participants. It just depends on the number of plants you're curious about. I think if I were to go back and do my dissertation again, right, we would all do it all differently. And I think I would have focused in a lot more on a subset of plant diversity and not tried to learn about every single plant in an agroecosystem. That was just so overambitious. And I think I would have been, I would have gotten much richer information about fewer plants, and I would have really loved that. But great question. And yeah, also going back again gives you that chance, right? You realize, oh, I should ask this farmer about this plant that we didn't talk about. And that gives you a chance to do it. Oh, Felipa, hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for your amazing talk. It's nice to see you and everybody. I just had an extra little follow-up question about interviews and recording information in them. I wondered if you like have ever tried using the apps or things like Kobo Connect on using a tablet. I haven't. I've always ended up doing everything in hand or with colleagues leading interviews on doing everything on hand. But then it leads always to this huge task afterwards when you're back home collating all the information. And even if things were done on a Kobo Connect or something, there'd still be the data cleaning and tidying, but adding all that transcribing. But I've not managed to do that kind of setup where you've got some kind of digital devices. But what's your advice on that? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've used Kobo Toolbox. I've used Open Data Kit a lot. I even have taught workshops on how to set up Open Data Kit surveys. They're great. Those tools are really good from my perspective when you have closed, questions where you have very predictable responses, and you aren't anticipating that the answers are going to be very nuanced or complex. So they're great for kind of household survey kind of data collection. There is the possibility now on Kobo Toolbox to record specific answers to each question. I think it's a little bit tricky to set up, but I'm pretty confident that would work. And that might be a nice approach if you're really technologically savvy. I guess lots of things are coming to mind. One concern is that you really have to look at your phone a lot as you do that interview, and I worry that especially elders in many of these communities you have to explain to them like everything is happening on the phone right now, and I'm not just distracted like their kids might be, when we're talking. And also there are privacy issues because the data is being immediately uploaded to a server, which some IRBs are okay with. I've had my IRB raise questions at Clark about how secure the Kobo Toolbox humanitarian server is, etc. So there's a lot to think about, but I think it can be really helpful. I definitely don't want to say, don't use Kobo Toolbox or ODK or one of those. And I agree with you. The task of transcribing is huge. The decision whether to translate first, kind of translate in real time from the recorded information, or to transcribe in language and then translate. I mean, those are big decisions. And then I also have some students who use in vivo to do qualitative data analysis, and that can be really helpful. And others, we end up deciding, the student I talked about today, Marshall, is doing his qualitative data analysis with an Excel spreadsheet. And it's been a lot more straightforward. So there's no one answer. So many things can work. Just depends on what you're doing.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Philippa. Christine, hi.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this really beautiful talk. So many things in there. I would like to, I love that you say try to go back to the communities. And I really wish and hope that people who write research proposals include that for budget and time to give this opportunity to actually return to those places and connect. I have a question about the content of those, kind of the communal diversity versus the little plots which only cultivate 2 beans. And I was wondering, since they know what is growing in each other's fields, is there a system of bartering, or do they really just eat what they grow and then know about the other varieties, or do they just keep that diversity flowing for consumption? Do they share a lot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is sharing among neighbors for sure. And I think that's where some of the knowledge about who grows what is coming from. But then also I think local markets are such an important place for people because many of them are feeding their family, and then I call them subsistence oriented because they're feeding their family, and then any surplus they're bringing to market for sale. And that's where they're coming into, there are sections of markets in Ethiopia that are not aggregators or wholesalers. They're just individual farmers selling what they have, and that's where they talk to each other a lot about. I would love to do a study just of those kinds of conversations and what information gets exchanged in the marketplace, right?
Like processing, different cooking. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I know there have been some great things, maybe you've done some of this, looking at, what happens when somebody does run out of seed for a particular variety and they do go back to the market and look for it. How does the market conserve in a way? It's a place where varieties are kept by somebody, whether it's another farmer or an aggregator.
Yes.
But yeah, there's a
Brilliant.
lot there.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that question. It's gotten me thinking. Thanks. Oh, hi, Gary. Gary Martin, how are you?
I'm doing good, so good. Thank you so much, Nishant, for putting this together, and Morgan for this fantastic. I just love it. Thinking about methodology.
It's an honor to see you.
Thinking about plant classification, all the things I love. Seeing a lot of old friends on screen. Good to see you, Christine and Trish and many others. There's no time left. I would have asked you about hypothesis number 3. So
okay.
Ending conversation about hypothesis number 3. I've been pondering it a lot. I think sometimes it's not complementarity, but could be maladaptive. And
Okay.
that's something I'd love to explore to you at some point.
Yeah, I would too.
That's connected to some work that we're doing here in Marrakesh, Morocco, where I'm calling in from, on resilient herbalism in the Marrakesh Medina, and dealing a lot with these issues of classifications and interviewing and all the things you've been mentioning. But I think, Nishant, you're probably eager that this session doesn't run over. So let's leave that conversation to another day.
Okay, we'll have it in. Are you going to be in Montpellier?
I'm going to try to do that. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm going to try to
it's
do
not
that.
far.
Yeah, it's close for me, and I've got it penciled in, so I'll probably be there. And I did note Morgan has been involved in the African Sciences of Agroecology, Nutrition, and Ethnobotany Network. We are launched group. Again our year 2. We have a series of webinars. Sorry to make a commercial announcement late in the day. But
great.
You may be interested, some of you, particularly if you are interested in African agroecology, nutrition, and ethnobotany. This is a network of people from mostly African universities that are exploring these issues in a bi-monthly webinar and an ongoing project about building the curricula and other opportunities at universities in Africa for these fields. Tomorrow it's on feminist perspectives, including gender and equity and social inclusion. So sorry for that pitch, Nishant.
Oh, that's great. Much appreciated.
That's okay.
Nishant, there was one more quick question in the chat that maybe I could quickly address. I think it's
please, please go ahead. Yeah.
It's kind of about, are there standard protocols? And actually, Gary, who was just speaking, wrote our seminal text on ethnobotanical methods. So that's a great resource to look at not only different kinds of interviews, but different activities to do in ethnobotany that are well established and known by most of us. But also the ethical dimension is really important. And I think our society, Society for Ethnobiology, and the International Society for Ethnobiology all refer to the same code of ethics, which is available on the ISE website, and there are links on the Society for Ethnobotany website. And that provides a lot of guidance as to things to think about when you're doing interviews and how to treat our participants with respect and beneficence and justice. Is it okay?
I see Esther has raised the hand. Would you like to answer that? Because we can, it's up to you.
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm
Okay. Okay. You can go ahead, Esther.
Not to answer really, but I had a question for Dr. Morgan.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you for that presentation, Dr. Morgan. It was very nice. I was really interested to hear about the work that you had done in Kenya, because from the flyer I read that this research you have done some in Ethiopia and another perspective in Kenya. So I really wanted to hear about that.
Too. Great. Really briefly, Alex again at the New York Botanical Garden and collaborators in Ethiopia as well as in Kenya are launching a new project, and they've been there. I haven't been able to be with them so far. I'm going later this year. It's looking at mixtures again, some that are traditional, but some that are new, mainly of larger grains, sorghum and maize, but also common bean varietal mixtures. And it's different in that it's linking the mixture production to school feeding programs. So providing those mixtures in school meals based on their nutritional complementarity. So they're exploring how markets for mixtures could be expanded in order to form regenerative school meal programs. So yeah, that's in Kenya with the Cereal Growers Association as the main partner, the Kenya Cereal Growers Association.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks
And
for asking about that.
my last question was, you mentioned in one of the slides that when you're doing surveys, you can find that there's a single plant that they're different, but the locals call them with like a single language and a single name. So how do you put this in the questionnaire?
So I want to make sure I understand. The scenario is where you find different plants that have the same local name?
Yes.
Yeah, that's really common. And so it's really important to collect voucher specimens and ideally be looking at plants with people, because if we're just sitting in living rooms or kitchens or wherever we are, it's really often hard to know that they're doing that. But yeah, I would say voucher specimens, transect walks, all these different ways to bring people to plants and look at the plants together, and taking photos and documenting what you see as a botanist and what the farmer is providing as a name. Because you're right, oftentimes one name can be referring to many things, and also many names can also refer to the same thing. That's the other possibility. The same thing from
Okay,
a
thank you.
taxonomic Linnaean perspective.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Morgan.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone for joining, and thank you again, Professor Morgan. Especially the last part where you talked about the importance of going back. I think I resonated a lot with that because I already missed the participants that I interacted with during my last study. So I think in the end, you will inspire a lot of people here to go back to the local communities that they engaged with. And since Gary is here, I mean, I just got reminded that I also used his book about handbook of ethnobotany during my research, which also emphasized on this aspect of having longer conversations and going back to the communities. Again, thank you so much for your time today and for the discussions. The recording will be available soon. And if you all would like to join again for the next student cafe, please keep a note on your email. We keep sending reminders for the next student cafes, and I hope that we see you again. And take care, all of you. We are a small community, so we need to stick together and stand with the indigenous communities and take this forward together. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Have a lovely evening and take care of yourselves. And see you next time in a student cafe.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.